In this video we're going to be looking at government failure and other reasons why the government intervened besides market failures. So these are just a couple of concepts that we kind of glossed over and didn't do properly before your last sack. So government failure occurs when the governments intervene in the free market, and in doing so they cause greater inefficiencies, reducing overall needs and wants and reducing the overall satisfaction or utility of society. So it's basically when the government stuffs up and makes mistakes. It often leads to reduced competition, which we know leads to increased inefficiency. Okay, so here are some really important examples of throughout the last 50 or 60 years where the government has stuffed up and led to a more inefficient allocation of resources. The first one is that they've set the minimum wage way too high. Okay, and that's led to increased production costs for firms, and therefore they haven't been able to compete with people overseas, and it's become much more unprofitable to produce in Australia than it is in other countries. It's also led to increased unemployment because not only are jobs moving overseas, but people are being replaced by capital and machinery because it's cheaper and more cost effective. And as we know, businesses will choose whatever is more cost effective out of labour and capital. So setting the minimum wage too high has led to significant structural unemployment. That's led to crime, depression, and impacted our non-material living standards and our material living standards. Another problem, tariffs and subsidies. The government set significantly large tariffs in the 80s and 90s. They were, say, 40 to 50% for things like cars and textiles and things like that. They often highly subsidised our manufacturing and textiles industries as well to make them more competitive. Now, the problem with that is it sort of eroded the competition. We weren't competing with nations overseas, and that led to massive inefficiencies, backwards technology. So we weren't, using the most up-to-date technology because we didn't need to, because there was less incentive to be technically efficient. It led to poor product quality and inflated prices for consumers. People were paying way too much because we weren't good enough at what we were doing, and therefore we were forced to pay higher prices. That's another thing that's led to increased inefficiency. Another instance of government failure is the high level of government debt. In the 80s and 90s, and again in recent times, Australia's government debt is now about $250 billion. Okay, so the government owes other countries about $250 billion worth of money because we're running budget deficits. And that's been mainly because of poor financial management. It's often because our companies haven't been competitive enough, so we aren't generating enough company tax, and an inability to raise taxes. And the problem with this is now the government is paying massive amounts of interest on this $250 billion. So every year we're paying, say, $10 billion in interest on that amount of money. That's $10 billion that we don't have for things like education, to spend on health, to spend on other government services. So our non-material living standards are suffering because we have so much interest to pay on this excessive level of debt. So that's another example of a government failure. Other government failures, financial regulation. So the government hasn't allowed for enough competition in the financial sector. So they've basically led to an oligopoly where there's a few major firms. And the problem with this is it's led to really high interest rates because, as we know, a lack of competition means they can charge higher interest rates, and therefore firms and individuals have been paying too much on their borrowing. That was another market failure in the past, another government failure. Other government failures, excessive welfare. Excessive welfare, more people are going to be unemployed because still getting a decent enough income, and that's going to lower national income because less people are going back to work. It's going to lead to a heavy burden on taxpayers because we have to pay for all these people on welfare, and it leads to high budget deficits. So that sort of links into that idea of increased debt from the government, is that we have had excessive welfare in the past. Another government failure is the government ownership in a lot of businesses. A lot of businesses were run by the government as kind of like government monopolies. So things like banks, telecommunications, airlines, railways, power. And because they didn't have much competition, there was less incentive for them to be productive and lower their costs, and that led to higher prices and less output, basically, and therefore inefficiencies for society. And the final one, we talked about the ACCC and how they have power to reduce market power. But one thing that people are arguing is that the government's given the ACCC too much power, and they've prevented things like mergers from big companies. And that's meant that Australian companies haven't been able to become more efficient because we can't take advantage of economies of scale. They're not letting Australian businesses become too big, but sometimes big businesses are good because they can produce cheaper, because they can spread their fixed costs over a larger volume of output. So the government has given the ACCC too much power, and that has led to reduced inefficiency as well. So there's 7 sort of key government failures. It's important that you know 2 or 3 of them and are able to discuss how they are examples of government failure. There are another 2 reasons why the government intervened in the economy. So we talked about market failures, but you also need to be aware of other reasons why the government intervened. And the first one is to redistribute income. So a market economy is great because it promotes incentive to be efficient and productive and work hard and get an education, but it also results in an uneven distribution of income. Because in a market economy, people just get paid based on their contribution to production. If you're smart, if you can get a good job, if you've got access to land or good labour resources, you'll get a really high income. But those who do not receive a factor income don't get anything in a market economy. So another way the government intervene is that they provide people with transfer payments or welfare to access basic goods and services, and this helps them to achieve a dignified standard of living. They also have a progressive income taxes, where those on higher incomes pay a higher percentage of their wage in tax, which again leads to a more equitable distribution of income. And finally, so they provide welfare, they tax the rich people more, and finally they provide a range of other services for low income earners. So public housing, education, so public education, healthcare, Medicare cards, that kind of thing. So one other reason why the government intervened is to distribute income more evenly. So you need to be aware of why a market economy has an uneven distribution of income and how the government can intervene to make that more even. And finally, and we'll learn about this more in macroeconomics, but the government also acts to smooth out the business cycle, so to prevent massive peaks or massive troughs in the business cycle. And that helps to avoid excessive inflation and unemployment. So it helps to avoid situations where we have too much spending and prices go up too much, or where there's not enough spending and people can't get a job. So the main ways that they do this is through budgetary and monetary policy. So through budgetary policy, they might, if we're growing too slow, they might lower taxes, or if we're growing too fast, they might increase taxes. If, again, they might boost infrastructure spending, or give grants or subsidies to try and boost growth, like they did again in 2009. Or with monetary policy, that's all about interest rates. So if we're growing too fast, they might increase interest rates, so people have less discretionary income, have to pay back more on their mortgages, and therefore they have less money to spend in other areas. Or they might lower interest rates when our growth is really slow, like they are doing at the moment, to try and boost discretionary income, boost consumption spending, mean that people are paying less money off more people are more willing to go into debt, and therefore boost spending in a range of areas.